Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics Podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order and the Morrison-Chevsky Center. We are a secular, progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name's David Wall, and I am the community's cultural programmer. I'll be your host today. For this, our 13th episode, I had the honor of speaking to writer, podcaster, and editor Arielle Angel. Arielle grew up in Miami, Florida, and lives in Brooklyn, New York. She's the editor-in-chief at Jewish Currents magazine and a frequent host of the Jewish Currents podcast called On the Nose. She's been awarded artist residencies at Hubbub in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Woodstock Birdcliff Artists Guild in Woodstock, New York, the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts in Nebraska City, and others. She was a 2018 New Jewish Culture Fellow and a 2016 Fellow at Tent Creative Writing at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, Massachusetts. In addition to Jewish Currents, her work has appeared in The Guardian, Guernica, and Off Assignment. Arielle received her MFA in fiction from Columbia University and also holds a degree in studio art and creative writing from NYU. Our chat covered many topics, including what it's like to wrangle multiple perspectives at one of America's most important Jewish left institutions during a time of unprecedented Israeli violence, and how to catch people when they fall out with Zionism. She even had some strong advice from my own organization, the United Jewish People's Order, as we all fumble forward as progressives in an ever-coarsening political landscape. Here's our conversation. Arielle Angel, thank you so much for agreeing to be on our podcast today.
Especially, thanks for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. Especially during your sabbatical, you get extra points for that. I'll try to make it restful for you. I'm going to start with an incredibly trite question, but maybe it'll get the juices flowing. I don't know. The question is, how are you today?
Huh. Well, I'm okay. I've been to group therapy and yoga this morning, so I think I'm, pretty all right.
Mellow.
Mellow.
Yeah.
Because I'm on sabbatical, I'm taking the opportunity to stay sort of away from social media and much of the news, since I'm just going to go right back into it when I get back. So, I'm managing to find this little kind of island in time to just rest. So that's how you're finding me.
And can I ask where you are, or is that secret information?
No, I'm in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay. You haven't gone to some far-flung island or something?
No, I'm in Brooklyn with my husband and my dog, and it's very cold today, finally getting cold. So
right.
That's where we're at.
Now I know Brooklyn. I have relatives in Brooklyn. Anyway, I wanted to start really, if there's any conceit or focus to this podcast, which is pretty loose, it's trying to find different ways that people who are radical Jews express that radical Jewishness. And so I like to ask, where did you get your Jewish superpowers? I know you're a Miami person.
That's right. Yeah.
And can you tell me about what your parents were like when you were growing up, and what kind of Jewish upbringing you had? Was it religious?
Sure. Well, I kind of had a strange Jewish upbringing in the sense that I'm Sephardi. I'm Sephardi, but I grew up in a Sephardi community socially, but all of my education and our synagogue was Ashkenazi, largely because you could sit together, the men and women could sit together, and that was pretty important for my mother. And my mother is also half Ashkenazi, and that was kind of where we came down because my grandmother really set the Jewish tone, and they were very very Zionist, went to synagogue kind of on holidays, mostly high holidays, not really big believers, but definitely very Jewishly involved. My mom was very involved in the Soviet Jewry movement,
Hmm.
and then was involved in with Americans for Peace Now. But the environment that I grew up in, that would have been far to the left of anything that I was picking up in school or in synagogue. And I pretty much swallowed the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. I went on the March of the Living,
Hmm.
which is kind of a propaganda trip to the death camps and then to Israel for Independence Day. Um, my dad, incidentally, just really had no interest in any of this. And, for my entire childhood, he kind of stayed out of all the Jewish stuff. His parents were Holocaust survivors from Salonika, and they pretty much hid for the rest of their lives.
Right.
And so, yeah, I mean, but the way that I experienced that legacy, which did not come from them, but came from the messaging that I was getting elsewhere, was that I had to really uh, revive, that I had to be the person who was, um, bringing Jewishness forward, and kind of reestablishing some kind of uh, practice or Jewish life for my father's family. Even though I didn't understand it that way at the time, that was kind of like the drive.
So it was your own mission.
It was yeah, like I feel like the message I was getting from sort of like mainstream Jewish
I
spaces
see.
was that
Yeah.
I had to kind of revitalize in some way, or kind of, yeah.
And what did that revitalization entail? Was it just
Well, it's just, I went to day school until eighth grade.
mm,
You know, I I was interested in learning Torah. I was very interested in Zionism,
mhm,
and a kind of Jewish identity, Jewish peoplehood. And I went to public school that kind of, it didn't disappear, but it just kind of, my world broadened. And when I went to college as well, I just sort of, it was always ambient, but it wasn't, it had ceased to become an enormous part of my life
I see. Yeah.
actively. Um, and I think that mostly changed in 2014 during the Gaza war, when my uh, Zionism sort of fell apart before my eyes, just kind of decomposed. And I had to figure out anew sort of what Jewishness meant to me.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you talk about it. I read an article where you talk about this moment where it was like a come to Jesus moment around Zionism.
Definitely not in college, way later. I was against the war. I was against the Iraq war, which was going on when I was in
Hmm.
college, which started while I was in college.
Hmm.
And but I mostly only went to the large protests. I didn't get involved in organizing because I understood that in these organizing spaces, they were also talking about Zionism and
Right.
connecting, stuff with the Iraq war to US imperialism. And that just felt to me like a bridge too far. Like I felt the way that I think a lot of the Jewish kids on campus now, who feel kind of threatened by activism because they feel like they're going to have to confront some of that stuff and don't want to. That was very much me. Although I have to say that it was me before, you have to remember, this is kind of before the kind of anti-Zionist wave in the kind of younger Jewish community. So
Right. Right.
it like nobody was pushing me,
Mm. So what happened?
2014. I mean, like,
But not everyone reacted that way. I mean,
no, but a lot of people did, I have to say. And I think there is sort of a question of why that was such a watershed moment for so many
right.
people,
Right. Was it
to the
just
point,
the scale
I
of it?
think it was the scale. But I think also, you start to see sort of like the shift in, uh, I don't know, it's like the memory, like the kind of like fear-based narrative around the Second Intifada was starting to fade,
Right.
and the Israeli narrative of like sort of what they were doing became, they started dropping pretenses around that time. I think it became a lot easier if you were paying attention to see the writing on the wall, and
Right.
um, for it not to square was sort of like the most moral army narrative
Right.
that had been sold. I mean, obviously, for many people saw that, and particularly Palestinians and Arabs around the world, didn't need any come to Jesus moment. But for those of us who were indoctrinated
Yeah.
in this way, um, that was a pretty important time. And of
Yeah.
course, since then it's only become more clear, I guess you could say.
Well, I'm always astounded by the statistics. Like I've seen you interviewed in various contexts, most amazingly on the Christian Amanpour show on PBS, which I just found remarkable that you were given all this time to
It was
really,
strange.
yeah. But you talk about statistics of some crazy numbers that I just find both incredibly positive and exciting, and also somehow hard to believe that, what is it, 44% of people under 30 think that
Well, let me maybe like unspool some of those, because the truth is we don't have any numbers for how many anti-Zionist Jews there are, because I mean, because the polls don't ask those questions.
Right, right.
And there are reasons why not all of them are just nakedly political, but they don't ask those questions. So what we do have are polls that ask people basically how they feel about certain words, apartheid, genocide, this kind of thing. And, in my experience, people who are using the word apartheid or using the word genocide, that's a correlation with anti-Zionist beliefs. I mean, there
Yes.
may be a few kind of outliers or, mavericks out there who are okay with those words and still consider themselves liberal Zionists. But for the most part, I think, especially before this most recent, the beginning of the genocide in Gaza, uh, these words, I think, have been very correlative with anti-Zionist political views. And so that's where I'm basically crunching an amalgam of polls that ask questions like that, essentially.
I see what you're
And
doing. Yeah.
and and
Yeah.
what we've found is that, like, reliably 25 to like 33% of all Jews answer, in favor of using these kinds of words. And I would say kind of in a way that kind of aligns them with anti-Zionism. And when you break it down under 44, that number goes up to around 40%.
Yeah, I mean, that's
And
an
and I
incredible
and I
number.
would
Yeah.
I would also say something else, which is that the Jewish Electorate Institute keeps asking people um, how uh, like whether they think what they think about arms to Israel from the United States. And initially, I think in November they asked this, and 50% of Jews answered that they wanted to cut the sale of arms. And I think I saw, and I hope I have a moment to fact check this afterwards, that number has gone up to into the 60s
Wow.
overall. So these are pretty encouraging. I'm not sure actually, like if I would say as reliably that those numbers correlate with anti-Zionism, but they certainly correlate with a kind of, um, you know,
L-
left-leaning impulse.
or lessening of a kind of fanatical unreasonableness. Let's put it that way.
Yes. Yeah, sure, sure.
And these, I mean, I find these numbers encouraging, and we're going to get to what can we look at to be encouraged by later. But when I hear you say these numbers, it's only positive. I want to skip back. I want to talk a little bit more about your trajectory before we get into some of these issues. So you were kind of headhunted to be at Jewish Currents as literary editor. Is that right?
I had heard about the revival of Jewish Currents, and I reached out to Jacob Plittman, who was hired to be like, "Hey, I'm here. I can help." And he sort of ignored my email. He's terrible at emails to this day. And then he read an essay that I wrote in Guernica around that time, and reached out to me as a potential writer. And when we met, we really hit it off. And I was kind of at that time thinking that I was going to try to raise a bunch of money and start essentially a new Jewish left secular institution. And he was sort of like, no, I have that. It's over here. And
It
like,
already exists. Yeah.
well, it's about to on
I see.
some level. I mean,
Yeah.
I say that not because the old Jewish currents didn't exist, but because, for most people in our generation, we had never heard of it. And so
Yeah.
clearly there was a lot of work to do in that
Yeah.
regard.
Yeah. So now you're editor in chief.
Mhm.
And from what I've read, and it makes total sense because our organization is the same, and most Jewish organizations, right or left, seem to be an uneasy coalition, or at least left of center ones or liberal ones, even before October 7th. Can you talk about the different forces and factions that exist at the magazine that you have to contend with?
Well, I mean, I have to say that there are certainly different viewpoints at the magazine, and it's been definitely challenging since October 7th to hold them together. But I will say that, like, from the beginning, we knew that this wasn't going to be a space, for example, where, we want to be accessible to a lot of different people. For example, we want liberal Zionists to be able to access our work and be moved by it, to have them engage with it seriously, for them to feel like it's trustworthy, and
Mm,
that they can take it seriously. There's been a very, I've always been very sort of intent that it would be kind of conventional formally in order to be able to be radical in content, and that it would be accessible and serious throughout. I always wanted it to be in other words, I wanted it to be a welcoming space for all, and yet, like, it definitely was never going to be a platform that also had a place for liberal Zionists. And we had people who came in early on, potential board members, et cetera, who really pushed for that. And my response was basically, they already have their own spaces.
yeah, they have their own forums already.
They
Exactly.
already, they don't need
Yeah.
us, and so that was pretty, we were pretty clear on that, and so we'd never really had to contend with that. Now we do have, for example, on staff Peter Beinart, who's a person who has always spoken to people to his right,
Hmm.
and who writes on some level, even though he himself is not a liberal Zionist, he writes towards them in order to convince. And I think if you're Peter Beinart, you have a good chance of being able to do that. He has a track record of being able to do that. I think that ability is not. I don't think everybody has that ability. I'll just say.
Hmm.
And I will also say that there's just people on the staff who that is just really not their main concern, and who they're focused on. They're way more focused on just the left and the Palestine solidarity movement. I would say that's where most people on the staff are.
Right.
I think when it comes to um, splits, it gets extremely I sometimes find it opaque, like where the fractures come up. But I do think that some of it has to do with how much or how comfortable people are um, kind of leaning into an idea of Jewish subjectivity in this moment. So in other words, like, do they, if we're Jewish currents, it seems very clear to me that we have a responsibility to kind of explore and sometimes even plumb the depths of left Jewish subjectivity as a left magazine. Now, where that goalpost sits and how much, who your kind of subject is for the Jewish left is a point of contention. Some people are more ensconced in Jewish religious communities. Some people are
Yes.
not. Some people are doing politics that are, Jewish communal politics, even on the left. Some people are doing more coalitional politics. All of these things are going to affect sort of where you think Jewish subjectivity belongs and how much space it gets, especially in this moment.
Hmm.
And those things have become, for me, that was never in contention, but it became in contention after October 7th because of just the extremity of everything that was going on.
Right.
And so I feel like that's where like a lot of the kind of splits have come up, and I also think it has to do specifically with questions about how we publicly mourn um, both like both the genocide and a loss of Israeli life. I think that that's something that people feel very different ways about.
Yes.
And also just like what our relationship is to armed struggle on the left.
I was reading, I think it was, um, there was a cartoon that was published in Jewish Currents that showed a pretty kind of bloodthirsty caricature of Kamala Harris after the
Hmm.
Democratic convention, and obviously it was referencing the fact that Kamala and Biden have been bankrolling the genocide in Gaza. But
Hmm.
there was I looked and looked at comments, and it was quite intense what people were saying about this cartoon.
Oh, for sure. And
Um,
and I'll also say that we had a lot of people cancel their subscriptions,
when
mostly boomers, after the Kamala cartoon.
after that cartoon, right?
Yeah. Not
And
a lot, but whenever like we publish something and if you lose, a dozen subscribers, that's significant, because
yes, yes, it
people
is.
have to really go out of their way or whatever.
Well, thankfully, you've gained a ton of subscribers, yes,
Yes,
since
yes.
October
But
7th.
it's just significant that the response to that was so strong.
The reason I mentioned is because we've had similar experiences, sort of assuming. Well, it's not that I don't know if this speaks to what you guys are going through as well, but we had kind of naive assumptions about certain consensus politics in our organization,
Oh
and
yeah.
these were dashed. After October 7th, it's like all bets were off, and we got some of the most like just really, really angry, bitter comments, especially when we put out our statement after October 7th as an organization that we vetted and hemmed and hawed over for days. And I was absolutely shocked by some of the reactions from our own community because I had assumed that there was consensus, and of course there was not. Um,
I can imagine, but I'm just curious how that looked on your end.
well, we had, you know, we felt we needed to write a statement after October 7th. We worked very hard on it. We had it vetted by various boards. Um, and there were, we were maybe naively talking about it within talking about the actions of Hamas within a tradition of resistance.
Hmm.
And so there was some of that, and there was, the condemnation of what Hamas had done maybe wasn't enough for people, et cetera, et cetera. There were all sorts of, it was being parsed like crazy, and we were called disgusting. We were all these, terrible, uh, uh, whatever the word is, curse words flung at us. And I was shocked. I stayed up all night, and I was quite shocked and quite traumatized by it, to be honest. Again, because I'd had this naive sense of consensus in the community around, certainly around liberationist politics in general, but also, of course, Palestinian liberation politics.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you've experienced the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to, we'll get back to some of these things. I wanted to ask about, and it kind of relates to this, the creation of safe spaces for left Jews, because a lot of the work that you do and a lot of, I guess, work that you've done since 2014 has been unraveling assumptions about Jewish identity vis-a-vis Zionism. Um, and, I just want to read something you said in a New Yorker article that I really love from earlier this year, um, that had an amazing title. The article was called "The Angst and Sorrow of Jewish Currents." Um, and you say the following, and I think it's fascinating. You say Jewish currents is the thing people are holding on to. People want us to be their day school, synagogue, everything. And sometimes I think we should give up the magazine, just do something to meet those needs because we have an audience that needs us.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
The question is, so it sounds like you are, the Jewish left needs somewhere to go. The sort of
Yeah.
post-Zionists or people falling from the state of Zionist grace, as it were, need a place to land, like a safety
Yeah.
net. So how do we create those spaces, and what do those spaces include? What do they look like?
Well, it's funny that you should ask this question because I'm actually writing about this right now. And I'm going to like preempt myself a little bit. But I think it's pretty clear that we need new Jewish institutions. And or maybe it's not clear. I mean, I think on the left, there's kind of a suspicion toward institutional life, and for good reason, because Jewish institutional life has kind of become sort of nakedly genocidal. And before that was just kind of passively so. So,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I completely understand that, but I don't want to confuse form and content here, um, because we need institutions to in order to have full lives and in order to be in real deep interrelationship with one another, spiritual lives, but also sort of the material lives. What happens when someone gives birth? What happens when someone dies? What
Mm-hmm.
happens when somebody's sick? Um, we need these. We need institutions to help us with this, and to help facilitate our communal life. And I think we are in a moment right now where we have the beginnings of people starting of realizing that the old institutions cannot be saved. There's just nothing there, and it's not going to work. And recognizing that we need to build something new, very urgently. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've talked. It's serendipitous because I'm writing this piece. I've talked to a number of different rabbis over the last couple of weeks, who are all sort of in different stages of, thinking about what's next for communal life. And there's a lot of different kinds of questions that they're asking. People they're asking, first of all, some people want to orient around the idea of diaspora. Some people are saying, well, even diaspora assumes a kind of center in the land of Israel. However, and
Yeah, it's a
you
complicated
know,
word. Yeah.
we don't want to do that. Why can't we just call it Jewish? I mean, why can't we take up the mantle of Jewish full stop?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need the word diaspora, for example? Some people are kind of, I mean, because I think everybody's very much on the same page that anti-Zionist, that centering around something that is about what it is against rather than what it is for, is sort of reinforcing the attachment, or
Mm-hmm.
like reinforcing the emphasis on this particular uh, axis of identification. And so there is a desire to kind of move in a different direction. I think that there are um, different questions about sort of what sort of thing you start with,
Mm-hmm.
like, is it chavurot? Like, is it, uh, do we need pulpit rabbis or not? People are asking a lot of different kinds of questions, but what I'm heartened by is that the work is beginning, the work of new institutions. Um, and yeah, I mean, I think right now, if you live in New York City, which is where I would say the largest contingent of the Jewish left is concentrated, and you want to send your kids to a, some kind of Hebrew school or some kind of even daycare that isn't going to, where you don't have to worry about what kinds of things they're pushing, you don't really have any options. And that's pretty significant, considering the percentages that we were talking about earlier.
And just
Um,
that's the number of Jews who live in New York City. My God.
no,
I
right.
think.
So you know, and it makes sense because this is a newer kind of identification. I mean, it's not new within the Jewish community, but in terms of having this kind of critical mass, that's newer. And most of these kinds of institutions, you know, were started with massive capital in you
Yes.
know, mid-century consolidations of capital.
Mm.
And so the question of funding is a major question, but you know, there is a path through, you know, if people start you know, divesting or, you know, disinvesting from, you know, wherever their kids are in daycare now and starting small in a place that might be run out of a church, you know, might not have their own space, but can still function. You know, this is the kind of thing that's going to have to happen.
Now, it's interesting. Before I pressed record on this interview, I said that I might be asking you for advice, and you said that you didn't have any to give, but I think you do. Um, in terms of Canada, in terms of Toronto, I think that the United Jewish People's Order is just the kind of organization you're talking about.
Uh-huh.
We have a Sunday school. We have, you know, we do our holidays. We do all this stuff. We are I'd say, post-Zionist, or, I mean, we don't advertise that we're anti-Zionist, but the place is full of anti-Zionists.
Hmm.
But so it is an option for people in Toronto. The question I have, and I recently listened to an episode of your fantastic podcast, On the Nose, that I would recommend to everyone, in which you and another staff member kind of had this jovial but also intense argument with what seems like a couple members of the kind of Jewish Currents old guard, or the
Hmm. Hmm.
and the conversation is about religion.
Hmm.
And so you know, United Jewish People sort of comes from a Yiddishist sort of Doikite oriented, you
Hmm.
know, here-ness tradition that is staunchly secular. So I'm asking you for advice, because we have these different factions in our organization pulling different ways. And it seems to be that the younger you are in our organization, the more interested you are in spirituality and
Yes.
Parsha portions and
Yes.
having religion at the holidays. And the older you are, the less you're into that. And I'm kind of somewhere in the middle.
Uh-huh.
Is it important to have, you know, we talk about the impossibility of wide tent in terms of liberal Zionism and stuff, but what about wide tent in terms of having a conduit for this kind of religious impulse?
I
Is it,
think it's a must,
yeah.
frankly. I mean, look, I think you're noticing the same generational trend that we are noticing. Younger people are more interested in spirituality and in text. That doesn't mean that we are religious. I mean, the frustration of my argument with the old guard is that they think we're all going to run off and join Chabad or something, and that's just not the case. And it's so I find it enormously rigid.
Mm,
This, you know, this orientation, this fear. I mean, and the on that podcast, I basically said, you know, you guys grew up in a time period where you were sort of oppressed by this and you had to break free, you know, your parents, your grandparents.
yeah.
But most of us didn't grow up that way. And we get to reclaim what we reclaim and throw out what doesn't work for us, you know, and reinvent and do all of that kind of work. So I just feel like I feel like it's a must. Well, first of all, it's a must because it's part of our heritage as Jews, our textual traditions.
Hmm.
And I don't think that you can get everything that you need as a Jewish person from just a history, you
Right.
know. I think there has to be something else. And I think that textual study can provide that without being, um, you know, authoritarian, frankly. And I especially in leftist communities that are already suspicious of that, you know, and who are in no danger of adopting that kind of thing.
Right.
At Jewish Currents, we do a lot of stuff. Like we have a column uh, called Chevruta, where we have basically organizers or thinkers bringing a query that they encounter in their work that can kind of only be answered, you know, ethically or spiritually, and where we use text, you know, these are Jewish and non-Jewish querents, and where we use text to sort of get another angle on it. And I find these columns to be enormously helpful because not all questions can be answered, you know, with a kind of cold, hard historical materialism, or even just with like straight strategy or whatever. The question of like uh the question of we've done questions about debt and whether to have children, whether it's kind of ethical, whether you
Right.
must have children or whether you
Right.
shouldn't. We've done ones on self-immolation and the kind of ethics of
Yeah.
self-immolation for political reasons. We're doing one now on the ethics of accompaniment in the West Bank. Like if for example, that you're bringing people into danger and they can get shot, like the Turkish American woman who was recently killed, but also that that that's what's necessary for,
Mm.
for the solidarity movement. What are the ethics of that? I don't know that there are like hard answers to these questions, and the ability to explore through Jewish text is a gift that we have that we shouldn't be afraid of using, frankly. And I'll also say that one of the things that I've noticed is that when things get like the most hot in terms of different kinds of ethical and moral questions that are, political questions where people are the most polarized within our community, it's usually a good indication that some kind of text study will be a good way to explore it. Because it's usually an indication where there isn't sort of a clear answer. And it's always better to sort of like sit in some of the gray of it
The
through
ambiguity. Yeah.
through
Yeah. Yeah.
text, which sort of abstracts, not abstracts it, but that the word I'm looking for is defamiliarizes it. That defamiliarizes it so you can get a little air in the room in another kind of way.
It's
And I
yeah.
haven't found another tool that does it quite as well.
It's interesting. It's almost like you're saying, because the cliche or the sort of trope is that religion is dogma. But what you're saying is that using a kind of spiritual text, using the kind of very Jewish analytic tool of Torah study, whatever it is, leads instead to doubt and spaces of ambiguity and uncertainty, which
That's been my experience.
yeah, yeah.
We did an event in two cities after October 7th, studying texts related to, it was called The Uses and Abuses of Grief.
Mm.
Like weaponization and I can't remember. It was like weaponization of grief and uh yeah, I can't remember exactly what it was called. But Rafi McGarrick did it in Chicago and New York, and
Mm.
we studied it, and it honestly, like, it really helped open up the conversation that I felt was extremely stuck.
Hmm. What about ritual? Because um, the United Jewish People's Order we take our high holidays and our seders and all these things quite seriously. But they are we're still staunchly secular. They
Hmm.
allow me. I studied to be a cantor, and they do allow me to sing the Kol Nidre.
Uh-huh.
Uh, but it's kind of smuggled in. Um,
Uh-huh.
do you, you know, there has been talk, and it's kind of creeping in that maybe we could have more of the traditional stuff, more God stuff, more spirituality in the rituals. I think
Hmm.
that rituals are incredibly important to a community. So this is another thing that we're dealing with right now in our community. What do you think about that?
That's really hard, I think. I mean,
Mm,
I feel more adamant about text because I feel like
mm,
just text is part of our hair. Like text is who we like. I feel very strongly that text is who we are as a people, and that the process of textual study is so important, whether you care about the spiritual elements or not. Um,
but does it need to be
but
Bereshit?
ritual,
Does it need to be the Torah, or can it be Das Kapital, like the text?
I mean,
Yeah.
it can be both. I I I, I think it has to be both.
Mm,
I think, but I just think, if we're talking about, look, the thing that I always say is what these older folks did not socially reproduce themselves. And part of the reason that they didn't socially reproduce themselves is because they themselves had a Judaism of rebellion. that in the age of kind of cultural assimilation and, after the loss of our kind of diasporic languages and
Mm,
after, we stop being immigrants and all of these kinds of things, after we stop being workers in the same way, there's nothing that persists of that life. We have to have some kind of touchstone if we're going to continue to be Jews meaningfully. And it just isn't what the old secular community, that stuff is gone. That world
mm,
is gone. They don't have, that much to hold on to. Uh,
mm,
uh, uh, and I think that there's a real resistance of mortality in not realizing that, you know. And
mhm.
obviously, like this group of elders, I respect them enormously. I love them so much. And I think that there needs to be a recognition that the conditions have changed. This is a very materialist group of people that seem to not recognize that we are in a new moment.
Yes.
Um, and so, I mean, you asked a question about ritual. I think that ritual generally is optional, and I'm not really sure why ritual has to be resisted. Like, can't there be, you know, rituals for people who want the ritual and not for not? And also, can't there be rituals that are more God agnostic? There's a whole kind of humanist Jewish tradition
Well,
to
that's where
draw
we
on
are.
if that was something.
That's where we are. The question I have is it you're talking about how we're entering a new phase, kind of, and is that new phase the United Jewish People's Order, which is a Yiddishist, materialist, in fact, staunchly anti-theist organization, is the new phase entering into engaging with spirituality and saying, yes, we can have a Kohenet come and do a liberationist Seder that involves God.
I mean, look,
Um,
I think that if you don't do that, you have to recognize that you're not serving the broadest political community that you can serve.
yes,
And like,
which
it depends on what your goals are.
mhm.
If you want to keep serving a small community that is committed to exactly this way of life, which is largely gone, then you can keep doing things the same way. And I think that's kind of like the same message I would even give to the mainstream Jewish organizations. If you want to keep serving a diminishing constituency, you can keep doing things the same way.
So you're talking when you say a larger political community, do you mean a larger left political community, as
Yes,
in younger
yes. I
people who
mean,
are
I
Yeah,
mean, I mean a
yeah.
larger
No,
anti-Zionist
I
or
see. Okay, yeah.
diasporist or whatever way you want to put it, left Jewish community.
So further to my asking you for your
I
sage
mean,
advice.
I mean, I'll just say, David,
Yeah,
sorry, you know this, like
yeah,
you're running one of those unicorn organizations
yes.
that happens to be there to catch the enormous wave of people who need you right now. And if you don't do these things, you can't catch those people because that's what they want,
Yeah,
you
no,
know?
I do think you're right. And further to that, um, the Ashkenazic domination of much of Jewish life
Yes.
it's still there. It's
Yes.
still there in so many communities. I know it's there where you live. And I
Yes.
know, so you're of Greek, at least half Greek Jewish origin. I know that your
Yeah.
grandmother spoke Ladino.
Both my
Uh,
grandparents. Yeah.
yeah. So how do we, is this also an important, like, are Jewish left spaces
Yes.
inclusive and cognitive enough of Jewish diversity or not? And does that need to be expanded as well?
Well, I mean, look, I think even particularly so in this like secular, left secular world that both of us, this very small world that we're both referring to.
Mm,
I mean, this is an Ashkenazi dominated culture with Ashkenazi reference. I mean, part of what came up in the argument on the nose is that um, the older Jewish currents, Nicks, Judy and Mitch, who I love enormously,
mm,
were just kind of extremely upset that, we don't have the same reference, specific people, specific songs, whatever. But those things would have never been in my lineage, reference for my lineage, like I don't have that background. And so it begins to feel uh I'm not against a sort of like preservationist impulse, around
Hmm.
some of this stuff. And it's not that I want it to go away. I mean, I understand when people, particularly Yiddishists talk about, okay, it's not that we're not trying to make room for, Sephardi and Mizrahi traditions, but we have to have room to reclaim the thing that we were denied as well, and there's obviously more of them than there are of us. Um,
Hmm.
so it is tough, but I do think that what we do need to think about is how we authentically expand our referent pool, because we don't we actually there aren't enough institutions or enough of us at this point to actually um to split off, you know.
Yes, yes, you're absolutely right.
And
There's like
so
there's like nobody.
I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
eventually
Mhm.
that we would be able to do that, and that would be great. And maybe at that point we will split into Ashkenazi and Sephardi organizations or institutions. But I just don't see that happening for a while.
Mhm.
And also, like, I don't know if we'll ever fully have that again, to be honest, because Jewish life, particularly in the United States, has been so homogenizing, and it takes such an enormous effort to kind of reclaim. And frankly, it's not a project that I'm personally that interested in. Like, I'm not going to go back and learn Ladino. That world is gone to me.
Interesting.
So so I think like we are just going have to work together to expand the reference.
Mm. Yeah, this does really does it's hard not to fall, for me anyway, to fall into the trap that feels like this really is a moment, that the post October 7th world is this kind of watershed, a historic moment for Jewish communities.
Yeah,
But it really does feel that way. And I think
I
with
think
that,
it absolutely is.
yeah, and it includes promise. It includes possibility and
Yeah.
positivity.
Yeah,
But I
I
do want,
agree.
yeah, I do want to get to, just before we end, I do want to get to another thing that you said in that same excellent article. You said the period after October 7th was the most acute grief you've ever felt before your father died. And it was your unequivocal orientation post October 7th that you had to keep everyone in. So,
Yeah.
can you talk about the nature of that grief before your father died? What is the complexity of that grief? I guess on a very sort of obvious level, we can talk about who you were grieving, but what was the nature of that grief? And then what do you mean that you had to keep everyone in?
Well, I look, I feel like for a very, very long time, people have been asking me where they think things are going in Israel Palestine. And if I feel really comfortable, what I would say is I think there's going to be a genocide. And I think part of that is like, you know, part of that is following the story very, very closely and seeing the seeds of a kind of genocidal mindset taking hold over many years, and seeing that borne out in policy and seeing that there are no guardrails. But another part of it is also being the, grandchild of survivors and sort of always waiting for the next, being on guard and hyper vigilant for the next genocide. And I think it was both. I really always felt like things were heading in that direction. And Um, that was the first thing I said on October 7th when I woke up to what was happening. I turned to my husband. I was hysterically crying, and I just said there's going to be a genocide. And it just that felt very clear to me. Um, but I will say that, obviously, like, Jewish Currents as a community is not as valuable if it doesn't have Palestinians in the community. I don't think it demonstrates what it's trying to demonstrate politically without Palestinians. And certainly there were a lot of Palestinians who weren't crying, even with the kind of awareness of what might come next, who were exhilarated by October 7th, but at least by the feeling of agency, if not by all aspects of it, you know.
Mm.
And and
Okay.
I think that there were people within Currents who felt uh, either who felt that feeling or who felt an obligation to um, make space for that feeling. Um, and I certainly feel an obligation to make space for that feeling, but that just wasn't my initial response. Um,
Meaning the response wasn't that the hooray of the prison break.
yes,
Right.
it was grief, and
Mm.
it was uh, preemptory
Yeah,
grief,
when
you
you
know,
said you thought there was going to be a genocide that morning, a genocide of whom?
of Palestinians.
Right, right, right.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes, we all said that, yeah.
yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
you know, so I was just, you know, I was mourning kind of like the whole unfolding, like what was about to happen, what was happening and what was about to happen, the kind of whole sweep of it I felt.
Mm.
And also just recognizing what, you know, I think it's very easy and obvious to uh mourn uh kind of for the loss of life, but there's also kind of a narrative mourning, you know, just like a sense that that things weren't resolved differently at any other point,
Mm.
that every single other uh, off ramp was sort of foreclosed, and also the sense of like just the recognition that this is going to also change. You know, this isn't like the number one thing, obviously, but it's just a recognition, considering where I sit, that this is going to change the shape of Judaism, its meaning, for generations, just in the same way that the Holocaust changed the meaning of Germanness forever, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
um, and that we were moving into a kind of different phase uh, of our
Yeah.
experience of being Jewish in the world.
That's what I was getting at before with it's hard to resist the idea that this is just a momentous before and after.
Yeah, absolutely. I
Um,
agree.
so there's a persistent, this relates to what you were just saying. There's a persistent post October 7th trope that's constantly talked about by, in interviews and all over the place by journalists. And there's just there's an assumption that that Hamas's actions were horrific and not necessarily justified. And then we have to start any conversation with that assumption. Well, what Hamas did was terrible, but, or whatever it is.
Hmm.
Um, Even before we start talking about the genocide or the morality of the IDF, is there a world in which we're able to place Hamas in a history of liberation as armed resistance? Is it ever justified?
I mean, I don't think we can think about the question of like individual acts as justified or not justified. Do you know what I'm saying? I think that we have to place Hamas itself as an organization with military goals in the context of anti-colonial resistance. I just don't think we actually, it's not really up to us, put it that way. You know,
Hmm.
I mean, like that is how they will be regarded historically when all is said and done. You know, I mean, we just see this over and over historically that groups that, are, you know, designated terrorist groups go on to make peace and bring kind of national liberation. And that is, I think, hopefully what we will see in this case. I mean, I think it's been very interesting to watch what Hamas has been doing since October 7th and their overtures for ceasefire, but also what they're asking for, like that they're asking, for example, for the liberation of Marwan Barghouti and
Hmm.
indicating that they don't want to, that they don't necessarily want to lead in any kind of coalitional politics. I think that these are pretty, they're signaling sort of what their orientation is, and it's far more shrewd and it's far more geared at a kind of Palestinian collective than it is at a narrow Islamist vision, at least in my view. I'm no expert on specifically Hamas, although I do listen to people who are. So yeah, I mean, look, I think somebody sent me actually the other day a paragraph by Frederick Douglass, who was talking about John Brown at Harper's Ferry, and was saying, it's good that people recoil from loss of life. Like that's good because loss of life is bad. I mean, like you don't. Nobody likes murder. Nobody likes these kind of heinous acts and killing, people who are unarmed and these kinds of things. But you have to, I mean, I don't want to repeat again for the thousandth time. You have to look at the context, that this was also a military operation. And whether it could have been achieved in a way that killed far fewer civilians, I think probably it could, but also like I'm not the one on the ground making those decisions.
We're drawing to our hour. I just wanted to ask one more question.
Sure.
I kind of intimated it before, and you were asked this question on the Christian Amanpour show, and it seemed sort of boilerplate. I'm going to change it a bit. So you were asked about hope. I'm going to ask about how we stop from falling into paralysis. I feel sometimes paralyzed because the genocide's going on, and when is it going to end? Because of Trump, and it's easy for Canadians to be smug about our country, but we're about to have a right-wing demagogue become our prime minister. The sort of fungus-like creep of extreme right-wing politics all over the world.
Mazel tov.
Yeah. How do we not be paralyzed as activists, as Jewish activists or activists in general? How do you keep
I mean,
kind of energy?
I'm gonna channel, personally, my contribution to the movement is through writing and thinking. So I don't want to kind of engage in any stolen valor. And I'm going to channel my organizer friends who say that you have to organize. And that's not a very exciting answer. What I will add to that is that right now, I think one of the things that is the most cancerous way of engaging in activism is online. And I think that basically the best antidote, the real antidote, is to actually get into some spaces and to start working with other people as locally as possible to start doing things. I think that there's a way of engaging in activism that is about engaging in discourse. And unfortunately, that is like where I'm situated as the editor of Jewish Currents.
Yeah.
But I would say that we need far less of that, not to put myself out of a job, and far more of actually narrowing the gap between theory and practice and actually, working with people.
Yeah.
I think that some of the arguments that people are getting into online and otherwise are kind of evidence of a broader gap between theory and practice. And I think also these elections are indications that that the left is not prepared and also not really living in the real world on some level. And so I just feel like the only thing we can do is be together in the same space working on something that is meaningful. And I don't think there's any other answer than that.
Amen. Please don't talk yourself out of your job because, you did say theory and practice, and we still need theory. We need both those things, and we need the wonderful thinking and writing and art and poetry and all the stuff in Jewish Currents magazine, which was my all-time favorite magazine, I have to say.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
So keep up the good work.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Very nice speaking to you.
Very nice speaking to you, David. Appreciate it.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening. And we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin and our guest, Arielle Angel. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. My name's David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.